Hi, I came back to Space 55. This is a end of the year group show covering a lot of important NFT artists that the Space O director on has been associated with. The first one is by Cowboy Killer. Cowboy Killer is a really has many references in popular culture. Famous band. There's a name under the same title. Interesting thing about being NFT artists, they all use a nickname, and we don't know exact their identity. And it's important for me, and also exciting for me to observe him and his work without any background information. But obviously, he was really into the kind of 1990s for a kind of stage photography, very famous in America, because a lot of photographers actually work in both fields, art photography or fine arts photography, while they're working for film industry. The strong influence of the filmic representation, lighting, and also very kind of set up types of cinematography, which is really not allowable for a lot of fine arts before the 1990s, because the artists actually in photography tended to emphasize immediacy, whereas you can see they're very kind of reference to some kind of stage image, pictorialism of certain painting. Of course, we know there's a lot of references to Edward Hopper, but in this case, it goes back to the whole mythology of American life, middle-class life. This photograph was done by Cowboy Killer, who was coming from California. There's a reference to this figure, juxtaposition of female and male figures. We don't know exactly what had happened, but there's some sense of stillness, something that is quite older in the background, but this particular two figure juxtaposition is quite unique, but we don't know exactly what had happened. We don't know what had happened before and what had happened after. Another interesting thing is that though, as this photograph was represented by NFT, you see the camera moves closer as well as move backward, as much as our audience's vision is kind of observing different parts of photography. Here, the movement is not insinuated in the photograph itself, but more in terms of our perception, because we have to put our own understanding of what had happened before and after. Is she died, or she was totally exhausted? Why is not really doing anything, just holding herself? Is she kind of be just exasperated, or he knows that she has already passed away? What is the relationship between them? Is it a romantic relationship, or is this man observing this female figure and we just looking at him observing her? So there's a lot of references. But unlike the stage photograph, as best exemplified by Gregory Crewson, there is less strong emphasis of lighting, but more in terms of how this image can actually moving back and forth. And we can see this not with the help of some like strong lighting and contrasting of some kind of background, but with our understanding that is actually moving closer and as well as moving distance. So there's a kind of interesting depth, not in the photograph itself, but how this NFT image kind of inviting us as it moved either very closer or closer to us, as well as moving backward from us. As we move really, really distant from us, it suddenly becomes like a bird's eye view. Thank you. I always like to see how different medium influenced each other. We talked about painting interdimensionality as well as the photography and cinema. But also interesting thing is how people actually perceive this kind of photographic image these days. And it reminds me of VR. As she's wearing this VR, because this is the really center of the universe. So whatever happened outside is always related to the self-observing. On the top of it, this observer actually part of this image as it goes on. That's also the characteristic of game. I mean, the image itself does not really have any differences. It's really kind of culture differences. The game designer also used all animations, drawings, digital drawing, painting, all kinds of technology valuable these days. One thing that the game stands out from the rest of artistic medium is the really center of the observer, user. Here we can see this character, observer, is actually constantly appearing. But also the other background image is kind of reflections of what she is actually participating. She's moving, walking as a part of it. And also sometimes a different image, either very close up as a distance landscape, is really part of what she is seeing. So we are seeing her as she's observing something as she's moving around. Going back to the story of human figure, with surrounding, interplaying with each other, I come back this very interesting image because it really goes back to the idea that the human body really center of our medium. Now this medium is constantly interplay with this kind of background. If you read closely, it's inner part of the human organ. But at the same time, at the age of post whatever humanistic condition, you can see this inside image and the observing, or what the technological means that kind of working with the human figures or around the human body is kind of really kind of collapsed. So again, there's kind of center of the universe, kind of organic human being is moving, is interacting, is really kind of the main figures and the powers of the universe, but this kind of inside and outside is really collapsed. As much as a human figure and this there very much psychological as well as mechanical environments always kind of collapse it together. We can say it's a pathological conditions as a human being is so much center of the universe. But at the same time, this is a part of NFT because it's really viewed the internet, viewed in a personal computer as the younger generation, what we call MZ generation, kind of really create their own entire universe. Hello, these are the two most famous artists. I wasn't really familiar with NFT artists, and Mr. An, the director of Space O, introduced me. And one on the left is by Deekay, the Korean artist. He was supposed to be the most famous and very successful. His works is sold in a really high price. But compared to the earlier artists that I have described, this artist really has much more flat canvas. The image was a central character and situated in the lower ground, but all his desk and the lab, what I call lab, the studio, is full of what he's doing as an artist. So it's really autobiographical. And you can see a lot of things happening, but unlike the earlier artists, there's a less depth. There's no foreground and a background. Rather, their characters sit at the lower bottom of this screen, and a lot of things happening horizontally, but vertically, but on the surface. The camera doesn't really move around. It just to stay still. Rather, what we as a viewer can see is a small details. The desk, the object, vases, the shelf. There's an interesting way to go back to the very folk painting, what we call Chekkado in Joseon Dynasty. I don't see any really essentially Korean sensibility. But what's interesting thing is compared to the other works by NFT artists, this Korean artist's very famous work is Stand Still and very surface oriented. The things is happening on the margins, and the viewer can tend to focus on the details of the object. And speaking of the detailed object, and this image is really kind of static, and as well it can be easily translated into the different types of artistic production. I can say the sticker, the goods. These days, the culture has proliferated in many different forms. It's not just appropriating the images from popular culture and you then to say the collapse between the collapse of the boundary between fine arts and design. It's rather the image itself can be easily turned into a marketable items. I never really thought about NFT in terms of this historical distinction. But there's a very obvious culture related to the goods, related to the small details and posters and other graphic items. And this NFT artist really presented is a two-dimensional image as a kind of showcase for further elaboration and ramification for design products. Another aspect is since we really kind of stay still on the surface image, we become familiar with this character, iconic image of this character on the bottom. We identify with him as a creator. On the right, this one is very famous artist, Billelis. I mean, a lot of artists' name is really unfamiliar. Probably they use nickname as like a faker, the very competitive game player. So this is kind of mysterious figure. And I tended to see this character more as iconic figure. This was done by designer of Diablo. I'm in the 50s. I'm not really familiar with a lot of games, but certainly this image, Diablo-related image, something related to evil. Another interesting characteristic of the NFT artists is that they tended to use very high digital technology to create the very classical image. Obviously, this image again talked about the god or goddess in Greek mythology. The women having the whole pools of snakes on the top of the head certainly reminds the audience of the Medusa, the heroic yet scary and very horrendous figure. And whenever she look at somebody or somebody actually kind of staring at Medusa, they are turning to the stones and rocks. If you look at this image, there's a top part with a sophisticated and very refining and glossy surface of snakes, which has an interesting contrast with the bottom parts, the hair, the face, and the skins, which really has a reminiscence of rocks and stones. And of course, Greek statue. Mr. An constantly emphasized how the art of the NFT kind of returned to the original state of Greek and traditional academic paintings. And in both ways, the Deekay and Billelis, they both emphasize this kind of iconic image, Medusa, the main character. And unlike the other works, again, in this picture, there's no depth. And the camera is actually moving upward and lower part, moving back and forth. The camera is not really kind of getting into the character. It stays still and touches on the surface of the character. In the end, these are two important characters. It's so much get attentions of the people, not just about the artistic achievement, but more about how they kind of put their own character, very familiar, almost iconic and religious, this image on the screen, and as well as digital space. So it's really about the fan culture, how you actually bring up this symbolic character and constantly repeat this image. So the whole camera is not really getting into the narrative they might represent, but more about this character itself. Stay still, distance, but still mongering and almost celebrating and admiring this character as much as NFT is about fan culture. Thank you.